There's a locked door in your neighborhood that you've walked past 100 times, and every single time you pass it, a small part of your brain whispers the same question. What's behind it? This isn't just curiosity. It's something far more primal, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than most people realize. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is climbing a fence they shouldn't climb, opening a door they shouldn't open, or walking into a space where they absolutely do not belong. And the fascinating, terrifying truth is that they know exactly what they're doing. They know it's illegal. They know it's dangerous. They know they could get hurt, arrested, or worse, and yet they can't stop themselves. Over the next hour, we're going to explore one of the most powerful and least understood aspects of human psychology, the magnetic pull of forbidden spaces, and why certain people feel an almost irresistible compulsion to enter places they're not supposed to be. This isn't a guide on how to trespass or explore abandoned buildings. This is a deep psychological analysis of why these spaces hold such power over the human mind. What happens in your brain when you cross that boundary from legal to illegal, and why some people become genuinely addicted to the rush of entering forbidden territory. We'll examine the neuroscience of transgression, the evolutionary psychology of exploration, the social factors that drive people toward abandoned and restricted spaces, and the very real psychological consequences that come from repeatedly exposing yourself to these environments. Whether you've ever felt this pull yourself, know someone who engages in urban exploration, or simply want to understand why humans are drawn to danger and the forbidden, what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you think about risk, curiosity, and the spaces we're told to avoid. This goes far deeper than adrenaline junkies looking for thrills. We're talking about a complex psychological phenomenon that combines childhood developmental patterns, social alienation, the search for authenticity in an artificial world, and a fundamental human need to test boundaries and prove autonomy. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just why people do this, but what it reveals about human nature itself. Part 1. The psychology of transgression. Let's start with the most fundamental question. What actually happens in your brain the moment you decide to cross a boundary you're not supposed to cross? The psychology of transgression is far more complex than most people realize, and understanding it requires us to look at multiple interconnected systems in your brain and mind that all activate simultaneously when you make the decision to enter forbidden space. The first and most obvious component is what neuroscientists call the reward anticipation system. When you see a locked door, a no trespassing sign, or an abandoned building behind a fence, a very specific part of your brain called the ventral striatum begins to activate. This is the same system that responds to the anticipation of any reward, whether that's food, money, social approval, or in this case, the unknown experience that lies beyond the boundary. What makes forbidden spaces uniquely powerful is that the reward is entirely uncertain. You have no idea what you'll find, and this uncertainty actually makes the anticipation more intense, not less. Research in behavioral psychology has consistently shown that variable rewards that are unpredictable in their nature or magnitude, create stronger compulsions than consistent predictable rewards. This is why gambling is addictive. You never know what you're going to get. When you enter a forbidden space, you're essentially gambling with experience itself. Maybe you'll find something amazing, something beautiful, something that makes for incredible photographs or stories. Maybe you'll find nothing at all. Maybe you'll encounter danger. This variability is psychologically intoxicating. But the reward anticipation is only part of the equation. The second major component is what psychologists call reactance theory. This is a fundamental principle of human psychology that states when people feel their freedom is being restricted or threatened, they experience psychological reactance, an uncomfortable motivational state that drives them to reassert their freedom by doing exactly what they've been told not to do. Every no trespassing sign isn't just a warning. For certain personality types, it's a challenge. It's someone else trying to control your behavior, trying to tell you where you can and cannot go. And the human mind has a deep, evolutionarily programmed resistance to external control. This reactance is stronger in certain individuals based on their personality traits and developmental history. People who score high in trait reactance on psychological assessments are individuals who have a particularly strong need for autonomy and a particularly strong resistance to authority and external control. These are often the same people who felt restricted or overly controlled during childhood and adolescence, who chafed against parental rules, school regulations, and social expectations. For these individuals, every boundary becomes a test of whether they're truly autonomous or whether they're still being controlled by others. The third component of transgression psychology is something called sensation seeking, a personality trait that varies considerably across individuals. High sensation seekers have nervous systems that require more intense stimulation to feel engaged and alive. They get bored easily with routine experiences and constantly seek novel, varied, and intense sensations. For high sensation seekers, normal daily life feels understimulating to the point of being painful. They need the intensity, the novelty, the unpredictability that comes from entering forbidden spaces. What's fascinating about sensation seeking is that it has a strong biological component. Studies have found that high sensation seekers have different baseline levels of certain neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine, and their brains respond differently to novel stimuli. They're not choosing to be this way through conscious decision. They're wired differently at a neurological level. For these individuals, the pull toward abandoned buildings, restricted areas, and dangerous exploration isn't really a choice. It's a biological drive, as fundamental as hunger or thirst. The fourth psychological component, and this one is perhaps most important, is what we might call the search for authenticity in an inauthentic world. Modern life, particularly for young people growing up in suburban and urban environments, can feel incredibly artificial and controlled. Every space is designed, regulated, monitored, and sanitized. Schools look like schools, malls look like malls, houses look like houses. Everything is predictable, everything is safe, everything is known. For people who feel this artificiality as a kind of suffocation, abandoned and forbidden spaces represent something profoundly different. They're real in a way that ordinary spaces aren't. When you enter an abandoned building, you're entering a space that hasn't been designed for you, that isn't trying to sell you anything, that isn't monitored by cameras or managed by authorities. It's a space in genuine decay, following natural processes of deterioration without human intervention. There's something deeply appealing about this authenticity, especially for people who feel alienated from mainstream culture and commercial society. The abandoned church in the woods, the forgotten hospital, the decaying mansion, these aren't fake. They're not performing for anyone. They're just existing in their true state, and that truth feels valuable in a world where so much feels performative and false. The fifth component of transgression psychology is the element of conquering fear. For many people who engage in urban exploration and similar activities, part of the appeal is specifically that it's frightening. They're testing themselves against their own fear response, proving to themselves that they can function despite fear, that they can push through anxiety and do things that most people wouldn't dare to do. This is particularly important for people who may feel powerless or ineffective in other areas of their lives. If you're working a minimum wage job you hate, living with your parents, feeling like you have no control over your life circumstances, being able to walk into an abandoned asylum at midnight proves something important about yourself. It proves you're brave. It proves you're capable. It proves you're not just another passive consumer going through the motions of ordinary life. Understanding these 5 psychological components, reward anticipation, reactance against control, sensation seeking, search for authenticity, and fear conquest, helps us understand why forbidden spaces hold such powerful appeal for certain individuals. It's not just one thing. It's a perfect storm of multiple psychological needs and drives all being satisfied simultaneously by the act of transgression. Part 2. The neuroscience of boundary crossing. Now that we understand the psychological motivations, let's dive into what's actually happening in your brain at the neurological level when you make the decision to cross a boundary into forbidden space. The neuroscience here is fascinating and helps explain why some people find this behavior so compulsive that it borders on addiction. The moment you approach a boundary you're considering crossing, whether that's a fence, a locked door, or a no trespassing sign, your brain enters a heightened state of alertness. Your amygdala, the brain structure responsible for threat detection and fear processing, begins to activate. It's registering the potential danger of what you're about to do. You could get caught. You could get arrested. You could get hurt. The building could be unstable. Someone dangerous could be inside. All of these threats are being processed simultaneously. But here's where it gets interesting. At the exact same time your amygdala is signaling danger, your reward system is activating in anticipation of the unknown experience ahead. Your ventral tegmental area begins releasing dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with motivation and reward anticipation. This creates what neuroscientists call opponent process activation, where your fear system and your reward system are both activated simultaneously, creating a unique neurological state that's intensely compelling. This opponent process state is remarkably similar to what happens during other high-risk behaviors like skydiving, rock climbing, or extreme sports. You're simultaneously afraid and excited, and the combination of those two neurological states creates an experience that's far more intense than either fear or excitement alone. The technical term for this is excitation transfer, where the arousal from your fear response actually amplifies your excitement response, making the whole experience feel more intense and more rewarding than it would be without the fear component. When you actually cross the boundary and enter the forbidden space, several things happen in rapid succession in your brain. First, you experience a surge of dopamine as the anticipation phase transitions into the experience phase. This dopamine release creates a feeling of intense aliveness and presence. Everything seems more vivid, more real, more important. Colors appear brighter, sounds seem clearer. Your awareness of your surroundings becomes hyperacute. This is your brain's threat response, sharpening your senses to deal with potential danger. But it feels amazing. It feels like you're more alive than you've been in weeks or months. Second, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational decision-making and risk assessment, actually decreases in activity. This might seem counterintuitive. Shouldn't your rational brain be more active when you're in a potentially dangerous situation? But what actually happens is that your more primitive, emotional, and reactive brain systems take over. This is an evolutionary adaptation. When our ancestors encountered potential threats, stopping to rationally analyze every option would get them killed. Quick, instinctive reactions saved lives. So your brain essentially suppresses your rational override system and lets your more primitive systems take control. This suppression of prefrontal cortex activity is why people make decisions during urban exploration that seem completely illogical in retrospect. Going down into an unstable basement, exploring a tunnel with no clear exit, continuing to explore even after hearing suspicious sounds. These aren't rational decisions. They're decisions being made by a brain that's operating in a heightened, less rational state. And importantly, this feels good. The suppression of your inner critic, your inner voice of caution and rationality, feels liberating. You're not overthinking, you're just experiencing. The third neurological change that occurs is an increase in norepinephrine, often called noradrenaline, which is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is responsible for the physical sensations of arousal. Your heart rate increases, your breathing quickens, your muscles tense in preparation for action, and your perception of time changes. This is why people often report that time seemed to move differently during intense urban exploration experiences. Dangerous or highly novel experiences literally change how your brain processes temporal information. Now here's the critical part that explains why this behavior can become compulsive. After you successfully navigate a forbidden space and exit without serious consequences, your brain experiences a massive release of endogenous opioids, your body's natural morphine-like substances. This creates a powerful feeling of relief, accomplishment, and euphoria. You did it. You faced the fear. You explored the unknown. You didn't get caught or hurt. And now you're experiencing the natural high that comes from successfully managing a risky situation. This post-experience endogenous opioid release is incredibly reinforcing. It essentially teaches your brain that entering forbidden spaces leads to powerful positive feelings, not just during the experience, but especially afterward. This creates what psychologists call a reinforcement loop, where the behavior becomes self-perpetuating because it's so neurologically rewarding. Each successful exploration makes you more likely to seek out the next one, because your brain has learned that this behavior leads to powerful neurochemical rewards. For some individuals, particularly those with certain genetic variations in their dopamine and opioid receptor systems, this reinforcement loop can become genuinely addictive. They find themselves thinking constantly about the next exploration, planning trips obsessively, taking increasing risks to achieve the same neurological high, and continuing the behavior even when it starts to cause serious problems in their lives. This is addiction in the neurological sense, a compulsive behavior driven by alterations in brain reward circuitry. The phenomenon of habituation also plays a crucial role in understanding why people escalate their exploration behavior over time. Habituation is the brain's tendency to become less responsive to repeated stimuli. The first time you trespass and explore an abandoned building, your neurological response is massive. But the 10th time, your brain has adapted to the experience, and the response is smaller. To achieve the same neurological reward, you need to increase the intensity of the behavior. This is why urban explorers often describe a progression in their activities, starting with local abandoned houses and eventually moving to more dangerous locations like active industrial sites, tall structures for roofing, or exploring underground systems like storm drains and sewers. Understanding the neuroscience of boundary crossing helps explain why this behavior is so compelling for certain individuals and why it's so difficult to simply decide to stop. You're not fighting against a conscious choice. You're fighting against powerful neurological reward systems that have learned to associate forbidden spaces with intense positive experiences. This doesn't excuse illegal or dangerous behavior, but it does help us understand it as something more than simple thrill-seeking or rebelliousness. Part 3. The social psychology of isolation and exploration. One of the most consistent patterns we see among people who engage in extensive urban exploration and trespassing is a history of social isolation or alienation. This isn't universal, but it's common enough that we need to examine the connection between feeling disconnected from mainstream society and feeling drawn to forbidden and abandoned spaces. The relationship between social isolation and exploration is complex and bidirectional, with each reinforcing the other in ways that can be both psychologically revealing and psychologically damaging. Let's start by understanding what social isolation actually does to human psychology. Humans are fundamentally social creatures. Our brains evolved in small tribal groups where social connection wasn't just pleasant, it was necessary for survival. Being isolated from the group meant death. This evolutionary history means that social isolation creates profound psychological distress at a neurological level. When people experience chronic social isolation, several things happen in their psychology and behavior that make alternative forms of engagement, like urban exploration, particularly appealing. First, Socially isolated individuals often develop what psychologists call external locus of control orientation, a belief that they have little control over their social circumstances, and that their social rejection or isolation is due to forces beyond their control. This feeling of powerlessness in the social domain creates a strong psychological need to find domains where they do feel powerful and in control. Forbidden spaces offer exactly that opportunity. In an abandoned building, you're completely in control. There are no social hierarchies, no rejection, no judgment. You decide where to go, what to explore, how long to stay. This sense of agency and control is psychologically powerful for someone who feels powerless in their social life. Second, social isolation tends to intensify the need for novelty and stimulation. When you're not getting stimulation from social interaction, which is one of the primary sources of novelty and interest in human life, you need to find that stimulation elsewhere. Forbidden spaces provide intense novelty and stimulation that can partially substitute for the missing social stimulation. Each new location is unpredictable. Each exploration presents new challenges and discoveries, and the intensity of the experience provides the kind of engagement that socially connected people might get from vibrant social lives. Third, and this is particularly important, socially isolated individuals often develop rich internal fantasy lives and a strong orientation toward individual experiences rather than shared social experiences. They become comfortable being alone with their thoughts, comfortable in solitude, and even preferring solitary experiences to social ones. This psychological orientation makes solo urban exploration not just tolerable but actually preferable. Where most people would find exploring an abandoned asylum alone at night terrifying and unpleasant, someone who's comfortable with isolation might find it meditative, peaceful, even enjoyable. The relationship between social isolation and fearlessness in abandoned spaces is particularly fascinating. You might think that someone who's alone would be more afraid, and for most people that's true. But for individuals who have been chronically isolated and have adapted to that isolation, being alone doesn't trigger the same fear response it would in someone who's accustomed to social support and connection. They're used to being their only source of security. They're used to relying entirely on themselves. This creates a kind of psychological self-sufficiency that makes solo exploration of dangerous spaces feel more manageable. There's also an element of what we might call social rebellion or social rejection of mainstream norms that connects isolation to exploration. People who feel rejected by or alienated from mainstream society often develop a counter-identity based on rejecting mainstream values and norms. If mainstream society values safety, propriety, and following rules, then rejecting those values through trespassing and exploration becomes a way of asserting an alternative identity. It's a way of saying, I'm not like you, I don't value what you value, and I'm going to prove it by doing things you would never do. The role of online communities in this phenomenon deserves special attention. While urban explorers may be socially isolated in their physical lives, many of them find community in online forums, subreddits, YouTube channels, and social media groups dedicated to exploration. These online communities provide validation, shared identity, technical knowledge, and social connection that might be missing from their offline lives. But importantly, these communities also reinforce and escalate the behavior through social comparison and one-upmanship. When you're part of an online exploration community, there's constant implicit and explicit pressure to explore more extreme locations, to take better photographs, to push boundaries further than others have pushed them. This creates a social dynamic where the behavior escalates not just because of individual psychology, but because of group psychology. You're not just trying to satisfy your own neurological reward systems. You're trying to earn status and respect within a community that values increasingly extreme exploration. This social reinforcement can drive people to take risks they wouldn't take if they were truly exploring in complete isolation without any social audience. The phenomenon of documenting exploration through photographs and videos adds another layer of social psychology to this behavior. When you're exploring primarily to create content for an online audience, the nature of the exploration changes. You're not just experiencing the space for yourself. You're experiencing it through the lens of how it will be perceived and received by others. This creates pressure to find more dramatic locations, to take more impressive photographs, to have more exciting stories to tell. The exploration becomes performative rather than purely experiential. There's a paradox here that's worth noting. Many people get into urban exploration specifically because they're socially isolated and uncomfortable with mainstream social interaction. But if they become successful at documenting their explorations and building an online following, the activity becomes increasingly social and performative. They're no longer exploring for themselves. They're exploring for an audience. This transformation can actually undermine the original psychological appeal of the activity, leading some explorers to stop documenting entirely and return to pure solo exploration, while others fully embrace the performative aspect and essentially become content creators who happen to use urban exploration as their content genre. Part 4. The psychology of abandoned spaces. Beyond the act of trespassing itself, there's something psychologically powerful about abandoned spaces specifically. Not all forbidden spaces hold the same appeal. A locked office building after hours doesn't attract the same level of interest as an abandoned asylum. An active industrial facility marked with no trespassing signs doesn't fascinate people the way a decaying mansion does. What is it about abandonment specifically that captures human imagination and draws people to these spaces? The psychology of abandoned spaces connects to something deep in human cognition related to how we process time, mortality, and the impermanence of human achievement. When you walk through an abandoned building, you're essentially walking through frozen time. You're seeing a space that was once active, alive with human purpose and activity, but that has now been surrendered to decay and nature. This confrontation with the passage of time and the impermanence of human creations triggers profound psychological and even existential responses. Abandoned spaces are memento mori, reminders of death and impermanence. The Latin phrase means remember that you will die, and abandoned buildings serve exactly this function. They show us that everything humans create eventually falls apart, is forgotten, becomes reclaimed by nature. The grand house is reduced to rotting wood. The busy factory becomes silent and rusted. The sacred church becomes a home for animals and decay. This confrontation with impermanence can be deeply uncomfortable, which is exactly why certain personality types are drawn to it. They're comfortable contemplating mortality and impermanence in ways that most people actively avoid. There's a concept in philosophy and psychology called the sublime, an aesthetic experience that combines beauty with terror, pleasure with pain. Abandoned spaces often evoke the sublime. They're beautiful in their decay, fascinating in their deterioration, but also frightening, unsettling, and morbid. This combination of contradictory emotions creates a powerful psychological experience. You're simultaneously attracted and repelled, fascinated and disturbed. This emotional complexity is part of what makes these spaces psychologically compelling. The narrative element of abandoned spaces also plays a crucial role in their psychological appeal. Every abandoned space tells a story. The building was constructed for a purpose, served that purpose for some period of time, and then was abandoned for reasons that are often mysterious or dramatic. What happened here? Why was it left? Who were the people who once occupied these spaces? What were their lives like? These narrative questions engage our imagination in ways that active, occupied spaces don't. An active building is just itself. An abandoned building is a mystery, a story waiting to be uncovered. For people with certain personality traits, particularly high openness to experience in the Big Five personality model, this narrative mystery is intensely appealing. These are individuals who are drawn to complexity, ambiguity, and the unknown. They enjoy piecing together stories from fragments of evidence, constructing narratives from artifacts and traces, walking through an abandoned house and finding old photographs, letters, personal belongings. These become clues in a narrative puzzle. Who were these people? What happened to them? Why did they leave? The abandoned space becomes a kind of archaeological site, and the explorer becomes an investigator of forgotten lives. The visual aesthetic of decay also has psychological significance. There's something about the visual pattern of peeling paint, rusted metal, broken glass, and vegetation reclaiming human structures that many people find beautiful. This isn't universal. Many people find decay ugly and depressing. But for those who find it beautiful, and there's a significant community of people who do, the appeal seems to relate to appreciation of natural processes, organic patterns, and the integration of human and natural elements. Abandoned spaces also offer something increasingly rare in modern life, which is genuine solitude and silence. In active buildings, there are always people, always noise, always activity. In abandoned spaces, especially those in remote locations, you can experience true quiet and true aloneness. For people who find the constant stimulation of modern life overwhelming, this silence and solitude is precious. It's a chance to be completely alone with your thoughts in a way that's nearly impossible to achieve in ordinary life. The element of discovery plays a crucial role in the psychology of abandoned spaces. Unlike visiting a museum or historic site where everything has been curated and explained, exploring an abandoned space means you're discovering things that haven't been documented or cataloged. You might be the first person to see a particular room in years or decades. You might find objects or artifacts that tell stories no one else knows. This sense of genuine discovery, of finding things that haven't been found before, is psychologically powerful in an age where so much of human knowledge is readily available online. There's also an element of preservation through documentation that motivates many urban explorers. Abandoned spaces are disappearing. They're being torn down, renovated, or deteriorating beyond the point where exploration is possible. By documenting these spaces through photography and video, explorers feel they're preserving something that would otherwise be lost to history. This gives the activity a sense of purpose beyond personal gratification. They're not just trespassing for thrills. They're creating a historical record, preserving architecture and spaces that represent important parts of local or regional history. The psychological experience of being in an abandoned space is also fundamentally different from being in an active space because of the absence of social performance. In active spaces, we're always performing our social selves to some degree. We're aware of how we look, how we're behaving, how we're being perceived. In an abandoned space, especially when alone, that performance is completely unnecessary. You can be entirely yourself without any social mask or social awareness. This freedom from social performance is psychologically liberating for people who find social performance exhausting or stressful. Part 5. Risk assessment and rationalization. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of urban exploration and trespassing behavior is how people assess and rationalize the risks involved. The objective risks can be substantial. Legal consequences including arrest and criminal records, physical dangers from unstable structures, hazardous materials, and dangerous individuals who might be occupying these spaces. Social consequences if the behavior becomes known to employers, family, or community. Yet people who engage in this behavior regularly often have elaborate mental frameworks for minimizing or rationalizing these risks. The process of risk rationalization begins long before you actually enter a forbidden space. It starts with how you conceptualize the activity itself. Most people who engage in regular trespassing don't think of themselves as criminals or even as doing anything particularly wrong. They develop identity frameworks that reframe the behavior as something other than crime. They're explorers, documentarians, historians, artists, or adventurers. They're not hurting anyone, not stealing anything, not vandalizing. They're just looking at spaces that happen to be legally off limits. This identity reframing is psychologically powerful because it allows them to engage in the behavior without incorporating criminal identity into their self-concept. The legal risks of trespassing are real, but also variable depending on location and circumstances. In most jurisdictions, trespassing is a misdemeanor rather than a serious crime, and first-time offenders rarely face jail time. This creates a risk calculation where people decide that the potential consequences aren't severe enough to outweigh the psychological rewards of exploration. They're not comparing exploration to being a law-abiding citizen. They're comparing it to other risky behaviors they could engage in. And in that comparison, trespassing seems relatively low risk. The way people assess physical risks in abandoned spaces is particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. Most experienced explorers develop elaborate safety protocols. They check floor stability before walking on surfaces. They avoid touching structural elements that appear unstable. They wear appropriate footwear and protective clothing. They bring flashlights and backup batteries. They tell someone where they're going and when they expect to return. These safety protocols create an illusion of control over the risks involved. By taking precautions, they feel they've reduced the risks to acceptable levels. The psychological phenomenon of optimism bias plays a major role in how people assess risks in exploration. Optimism bias is the cognitive tendency to believe that negative events are less likely to happen to you than to other people. When someone reads a story about an urban explorer falling through a floor or getting arrested, their automatic psychological response is that won't happen to me because I'm more careful, more experienced, more aware of risks. This optimism bias allows people to acknowledge that bad outcomes are possible, while simultaneously believing those outcomes won't happen to them specifically. The concept of calculated risk is central to how experienced explorers think about their activity. They don't see themselves as being reckless or taking unnecessary chances. They see themselves as carefully assessing risks and making informed decisions about which risks are acceptable. The problem is that risk assessment is notoriously difficult to do accurately, especially when you're emotionally invested in wanting to engage in the risky behavior. Cognitive biases systematically distort risk perception in ways that make risky behaviors seem more acceptable than they objectively are. Confirmation bias in particular affects risk assessment in exploration contexts. If you've successfully explored 30 abandoned buildings without serious incident, your brain interprets that as evidence that the activity is safe, rather than evidence that you've been lucky. You remember all the times nothing went wrong and forget or minimize the close calls. You pay attention to stories of successful explorations and discount stories of disasters. Your brain is selectively processing information in ways that confirm your pre-existing belief that what you're doing is acceptably safe. The role of experience in risk assessment is complicated. On one hand, experienced explorers genuinely do develop better judgment about structural stability, dangerous materials, and situations to avoid. They learn to read the warning signs that a floor is about to collapse or that a building is too unstable to enter. This learned expertise does reduce risk, but experience also breeds overconfidence. The more times you successfully navigate a dangerous situation, the more you begin to underestimate how dangerous that situation actually is. This overconfidence can lead experienced explorers to take risks that a complete novice, operating from a place of healthy fear, would never take. The social dimension of risk also deserves attention. When exploring alone, you're making risk assessments based primarily on your own judgment and comfort level. But when exploring with others, particularly when there's any element of peer pressure or status seeking within a group, risk assessment becomes distorted by social factors. No one wants to be the person who's too scared to continue. No one wants to seem like they're overreacting to potential dangers. This social pressure can lead groups to make collectively riskier decisions than any individual member would make alone. The rationalization of continued exploration, despite experiencing close calls or frightening encounters, is particularly psychologically revealing. When something genuinely frightening happens during an exploration, like hearing unexplained sounds, encountering someone unexpectedly, or having a structural near miss, the psychologically healthy response would be to reassess whether this activity is worth the risks. But what often happens instead is a process of rationalization that allows the person to continue. The sounds had an innocent explanation. The person they encountered was probably just another explorer. The structure was mostly stable except for that one weak point. By rationalizing away the warning signs, people maintain their ability to continue engaging in the behavior despite evidence that it's genuinely dangerous. This rationalization process is reinforced by what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because you've already invested so much rather than making a rational decision about whether future investment makes sense. If you've spent years exploring abandoned spaces, developed skills and knowledge, built an identity around being an explorer, perhaps even built an online following or friend group around this activity, the psychological cost of admitting that it's too dangerous and stopping entirely feels enormous. It's easier to rationalize continued participation while telling yourself you're being more careful. Part 6, the dark side, when exploration becomes dangerous. We need to address directly the serious dangers and potential negative consequences of frequent trespassing and urban exploration. While much of what we've discussed has focused on understanding the psychology behind why people engage in this behavior, it's crucial to acknowledge that the risks are real and the consequences can be severe. This final section isn't meant to be preachy or fear-mongering, but rather to provide an honest assessment of what can go wrong and what the long-term psychological impacts of this behavior pattern can be. The most obvious dangers are physical. Abandoned buildings are abandoned for reasons. They're structurally unsound, contaminated with hazardous materials, or too expensive to maintain. Floors collapse, roofs cave in, exposed nails cause puncture wounds. Asbestos and lead paint create long-term health hazards. Rotted stairs give way. These aren't hypothetical dangers. People are injured and killed in abandoned structures with disturbing regularity. The thrill of exploration doesn't change the physical reality that these are dangerous environments. The encounter with other humans in these spaces represents perhaps the most unpredictable danger. Abandoned spaces attract a variety of individuals, some harmless and others decidedly not. Other explorers like yourself, but also people living in these spaces out of necessity or choice, people using these spaces for illegal activities, people with mental health crises who have sought isolation, and occasionally people with actively malicious intent who specifically frequent these locations knowing that others might show up. When you enter an abandoned space, you have no idea who else might be there or what their intentions might be toward an unexpected visitor. The psychological impact of frightening encounters in these spaces can be significant and lasting. People who have had genuinely traumatic experiences during exploration, being chased, threatened, witnessing disturbing evidence of criminal activity, or experiencing near-death structural incidents, often develop post-traumatic stress responses. They experience intrusive memories, hypervigilance, avoidance behaviors, and persistent anxiety. The very activity they engaged in for excitement and stimulation becomes the source of ongoing psychological distress. The legal consequences of trespassing can be more severe than people anticipate. While simple trespassing is typically a misdemeanor, the consequences vary dramatically based on jurisdiction, the specific property involved, and your behavior when caught. Trespassing on government property, critical infrastructure, or certain private properties can result in felony charges. Having a criminal record, even for a misdemeanor, can impact employment opportunities, housing applications, educational opportunities, and travel to certain countries. The long-term life consequences of what seemed like a minor legal infraction can be substantial. There's also the ethical dimension that deserves consideration. Property owners have legitimate reasons for wanting their properties to remain unaccessed. Insurance liability concerns, safety concerns about potential injuries on their property, concerns about vandalism and theft even if you personally have no intention of damaging or stealing anything. When you trespass, you're making a unilateral decision that your desire to explore outweighs the property owner's right to control access to their property. This ethical dimension becomes particularly problematic when the spaces involved are culturally or historically sensitive, when they contain personal belongings of former occupants, or when they're locations where traumatic events occurred. The progression from occasional exploration to compulsive behavior represents another serious concern. What begins as occasional adventures can evolve into a pattern of behavior that dominates your thinking and decision-making. When you're spending the majority of your free time planning explorations, when you're taking increasingly serious risks to achieve the same psychological rewards, when you're continuing to explore despite experiencing consequences, and when the behavior is interfering with other areas of your life including work, relationships, and personal responsibilities, you've crossed from hobby into compulsive behavior. The social isolation that often accompanies extensive exploration can become a self-reinforcing cycle. People who are already socially isolated turn to exploration partly as a substitute for social connection. But the time spent exploring and the preoccupation with planning future explorations further reduces opportunities for normal social interaction. The online communities that form around exploration can provide some social connection, but they're typically built around the shared activity rather than deeper personal relationships, and they can actually reinforce the isolation from mainstream society. The normalization of risk-taking that develops over time is particularly concerning from a psychological perspective. When you repeatedly engage in objectively risky behavior without experiencing serious negative consequences, your brain's risk assessment calibration shifts. What initially felt dangerous and thrilling becomes routine and even comfortable. This recalibration doesn't just affect your assessment of exploration risks. It can generalize to other areas of life, leading to poor risk assessment in driving, substance use, financial decisions, and other domains where accurate risk perception is important for well-being. For parents, family members, and friends of people engaged in frequent urban exploration, understanding the psychological drivers behind the behavior can help in addressing concerns without simply demanding that the person stop. Telling someone to just stop exploring rarely works because you're asking them to give up something that's meeting deep psychological needs. More effective approaches involve helping the person find alternative ways to meet those needs. If they're exploring because they need autonomy and control, what other areas of their life could provide that? If they're seeking intense novel experiences, what legal activities might satisfy that need? If they're searching for authentic experiences in an artificial world, how else might they find that authenticity? The question of when exploration crosses from hobby to problem doesn't have a simple answer, but there are warning signs worth considering. Are you continuing to explore despite experiencing serious close calls or frightening encounters? Are you taking progressively larger risks to achieve the same satisfaction? Is the activity interfering with work, relationships, or other responsibilities? Are you hiding the extent of your exploration from people close to you? Are you experiencing legal consequences but continuing anyway? Do you feel unable to stop even when you want to? These indicators suggest that the behavior has moved beyond recreational activity into territory that warrants serious self-reflection and possibly professional help. The psychology of forbidden spaces reveals something fundamental about human nature. We're driven to test boundaries, to seek novel experiences, to prove our autonomy, and to find meaning in a world that often feels constrained and artificial. Urban exploration and trespassing represent one way that people express these deep psychological needs, particularly people who feel alienated from mainstream society or who have personality traits that predispose them toward sensation-seeking and boundary testing. Understanding the psychology doesn't mean endorsing the behavior. The risks are real, the legal consequences are serious, and the potential for harm to self and others is significant. But understanding why people are drawn to forbidden spaces helps us see this behavior as more than simple thrill-seeking or youthful rebellion. It's a complex phenomenon that intersects psychology, neuroscience, social dynamics, and fundamental questions about autonomy, mortality, and authenticity in modern life. For those who engage in this behavior, self-awareness about your motivations and honest assessment of the risks you're taking is crucial. Ask yourself, what needs this activity is meeting, and whether there are healthier, safer ways to meet those same needs. Consider whether the satisfaction you're getting is worth the potential consequences, not just in this moment, but looking forward to your future self and the life you want to build. For those who don't engage in this behavior but want to understand it, recognize that the pull toward forbidden spaces isn't irrational or incomprehensible. It's the logical outcome of specific psychological needs, meeting specific personality traits in a specific cultural and social context. The same drives that lead someone to explore an abandoned asylum at midnight are drives that, channeled differently, can lead to remarkable achievements in exploration, research, entrepreneurship, or creative pursuits. The forbidden will always hold power over the human imagination. Understanding that power, respecting it while also recognizing its dangers, allows us to make more conscious choices about how we engage with the boundaries and restrictions that surround us in every direction.